Hello, welcome to another show of the History Hour podcast. I am your host, Evan Zarkadis, and today I am bringing you another episode of History Hour. In this episode, we are talking about the story of Lost Atusville, a black settlement in Maine from the American Revolution. But before we do that, I want to introduce our guest for this episode, Dr. Marcus LiBrizzi, professor of English at the University of Maine Machias, and the author of multiple books, including The Dark Woods, Chill Water, and the synonymous book, Lost Atusville. Welcome, Dr. LiBrizzi, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Evan. It's my pleasure to be on the History Hour podcast.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure to have you, and this has been a topic that we were so eager and excited to host on our podcast. So now, before we dive right into the questions about Atusville, I want you to guide me through what drove you into writing this book, and how did you find out about this story?
Well, it was really like a detective search in a sense, because when I was teaching at the University of Maine Machias, when I first came there, I would hear names of this former settlement, but there were really no signs of it. That there was originally a black settlement there, and it wasn't really included. It didn't have any books or chapters in any books. It was completely marginalized and kind of a negative space. But as I began to dig around more, I realized that there were ruins of this community there. There were signs of the old school, of the burial ground. There were living residents who had known the last inhabitants of the community. So I got intrigued and then put together a Maine Humanities Council major grant to do the funding to really dig in and drill down and uncover the story.
That's amazing. And where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Western Massachusetts, and I've been in Maine for a while, but it really helped having the connections in terms of uncovering the story through the small community of Machias, through my colleagues, through my students, because one person could connect to another. And as it's come to pass, since my book came out, some of the people that I've interviewed have even passed away, and their stories are at least fortunately preserved, because otherwise that would have been gone. So yeah, there was a lot. So I was originally intrigued by just what was this community, and then the more I dug into it, the more I realized that it was really small, but it had a very large significance and impact.
Yeah, and that's why I'm asking, because usually what the patterns that we see is that there's always people from outside of Maine that are trying to dig into the deeper unknown aspects of the Maine communities. So yeah, that's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah, I found that too as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So for our listeners out there, today we are talking about the story of Atusville. And Dr. LiBrizzi, the next question that we're gonna ask you is, in your book, you have split the story of Atusville in specific chapters, of course, with a different chronological aspect and order of it. So first things first, what is Atusville, and who created that community?
Yeah, good question. Atusville is the name of a former settlement in eastern Maine that was founded by freed slaves after the American Revolution. It was located on Outer Court Street in Machias, Maine, close to the railroad crossing that used to be there. It's now on the Sunrise Trail on the way to Whitneyville. Right now, it's just ruins left of the community, and parts of it have been rebuilt, and others has just grown over. There is a granite memorial stone commemorating the community in the burial ground. That's located about a mile down Court Street, past the Down East Community Hospital, on the way to Whitneyville. And in terms of how it was started, when the American Revolution ended, there was a portion of slaves in the Machias area that had helped with the founding of the community. And these slaves were not only helped clear the land and worked in households and on ships as mariners, but they also served in the American Revolution. A couple of them as really notable Revolutionary War heroes. So when the revolution ended and slaves gained their nominal freedom, they kind of just settled outside the community of Machias. Some bought land, others just squatted there, and then people moved in and mixed with the community, and it really began to grow after that.
So the question I guess that will follow with that is, so was Atusville at that time a separate, it was of course, as you said, established by slaves from the area, and and were those slaves freed during that time of the establishment of Atusville?
The slaves, some of the slaves probably settled there before they gained their freedom. Other ones gained their freedom after the American Revolution. The founder of the community, that's kind of given his name to the community, his name was London Addis. He was the slave of the minister of Machias, Parson James Lyon. He ended up actually buying his freedom. And I think that was more a thing of honor because of, and perhaps maybe even pressure from his former owner. But in a sense, he bought his freedom, but he would have been freed anyway. So it was really a kind of separate, but kind of unequal type of situation, because it was never formally founded as a district. It had its own name. They were separated from the other community, but they didn't really have, at least in the beginning stages, any really founding documents or charters that made that a separate community. Technically, it was just part of Machias. It would be considered a district. And that then later on, it got its name of Atusville.
Okay. And at the beginning of the establishment of Atusville, how many individuals were in the town, and were they all of African American origin?
Good question. It's hard to determine. All the records of African Americans from this time period are really incomplete. As much as 80% is what we have, and there's probably maybe even less. And so it was never a really large community. Probably at its heyday, which would have been in the 1850s, there were formally 6 households, but there were actually quite a bit more individuals that were living in this community, because I did uncover records where other African Americans had settled in established households, but they wouldn't have been on the census. And there were other individuals that were just squatting. And again, this went under the radar as well. While the majority of the community was African American, it was from the very beginning a mixed race community, a blended community. There were white individuals that were living there that had intermarried into the community. There were Native Americans that had done the same, but predominantly demographically, it was perceived and considered a Black community.
Very interesting when you say, because we don't really see that specifically in the state of Maine, and it's so interesting to know that back since the American Revolution, as you stated, there was an African established community, and it's such an important piece of Maine history.
I totally second that. Definitely ditto that point. And that was one of the things that inspired me and continues to inspire me about that. So much of, Maine is the whitest state in the nation, and yet a lot of its history is actually composed of a lot of racial and ethnic diversity that has gone uncovered as well. And so, and Atusville is a perfect case in point, as the intermarrying between the original residents, the Black residents of Atusville, and the larger white community continued. They became more and more blended racially as well. Yet the community was still at the same point in time considered a Black community, considered separate. And the descendants of Atusville, some moved away, but a lot of them have just stayed in the community, and now they may be blonde and blue-eyed just through generations of intermarrying with the larger white demographic that was surrounding them. So it's a really big case in point about how much more diverse Maine is, or even white is, the concept of white is, than we commonly give credence.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact, and you state in your book as well, that there is actually three different kinds of people that are there. There are the Native Americans, of course, there are the white settlers, and then there are the African settlers. And that makes it such an interesting case, and such I guess the word is a very significant community to represent that diversity in Maine.
I totally agree with it. And that's why the kind of quest, I guess I would say, to uncover Atusville was motivated by that drive to uncover this incredible story of racial diversity, of perseverance, of survival, but then also of really unfortunate circumstances that happened as well. But then also, as an author, I was also inspired and motivated by the kind of the gold mine of material that slowly uncovered through people that I spoke with, and then through reading between the lines of the different histories and reports, until there was just some amazing narratives that were involved. So the community itself is really remarkable, just that it existed. But then it had some real moments in its history that really still stand out as really significant. And just a few highlights of these like moments in Atusville's history. These former slaves that settled on the outskirts of Machias, they were directly involved in the plots and battles of the American Revolution. So that was one thing that really stood out. Another thing that stood out was the whole community's relationship to the Underground Railroad, to rumors of the fight and flight against slavery, also smuggling. There were racial riots that took place there. And then there were also this example of intermarrying that reflected a kind of tolerance and an acceptance for differences. So a lot of different stories that were involved in it within the main package of Atusville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just hearing you saying all these very, very significant events that happen, and thinking back to how tiny the settlement was, it's really remarkable. But so the question is, before I have a question about their involvement in the American Revolution, but before I do that, I want to ask you,
Sure.
Was Atusville one of the few Black settlements in New England, or do we know the existence of more?
That's another good question, Evan. Atusville was unique, but there were definitely other Black communities in Maine and in New England. There were Black districts in Portland and Eastport. There were little communities in Wells. There was probably the most infamous in Maine was the Black community in Fitchburg, Maine, that was settled on Malaga Island, pronounced by locals as Malago Island. And that was pretty infamous because the state of Maine dispossessed them of their land and also incarcerated a number of them and sterilized them. So it was a terrible story that happened, but it was also parallels and sheds light on incidents of racial violence in Atusville. But in terms of your larger question, there were definitely other Black districts and little settlements and hamlets scattered throughout Maine. And they really had to do with, and they really paralleled where Atusville's population of African Americans rose from the end of the American Revolutions to about the 1850s. And that was similar in other communities. And basically, any community that had probably more than 20 African Americans often had an area of that community that was designated as like the Black district. It didn't mean that all African Americans lived there, but some did settle there. And it indicates two things that kind of go to the core of this whole story, which is the kind of conflict between intolerance and being separated and not really integrated, having a separate community. Even if you were only 20 people in a town, you were still considered separate. But then at the same time, it also reflects the kind of rich racial and ethnic diversity in Maine, and the fact that there were intermarryings and trade going on, and there were a lot of positive things too. But it's really a story of both, of freedom and injustice that went hand in hand.
And that's what makes it a story worth knowing and worth studying. And thinking of Maine, you know, the majority of the population of Maine is not very aware of all of these instances and all these different communities. And as you said, most of the people see Maine as a predominantly white state. And it kind of is in some cases, but then there is examples like Atusville that go against that fact, and they showcase the incredible diversity that the state has.
Yeah, well put, Evan. Absolutely. And yeah, we could even go further. I don't want to go farther afield with the specific topic, but even what is considered white can be deconstructed because, like I said, many white residents of the Machias Bay Area, some of them are direct descendants of the residents of Atusville. And they would either know it or may not know it, but they certainly would pass as just looking completely white. So there's a lot more to the surface of Maine's history, and also more to the concept of what is even white.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, and I agree with that statement. Yes. So to go back and again, we're still on the first part of Atusville, determining what it is, and and going back from the title again, the settlement from the American Revolution, which is around when it was established. What involvement did Atusville and its people have in the American Revolution?
The residents of Atusville had a direct involvement in some pivotal events of the American Revolution. One of the most notable ones is the founder who gave his name to Atusville, London Addis. He, while he was a slave of the minister James Lyons in Machias, he also served as a privateer in the American Revolution. He served at Fort O'Brien in Machiasport. He really emerged as a Revolutionary War hero, and even a local hero. At one point in time, the residents of Machias were experiencing real deprivation and starvation during the American Revolution, and he was able to get his boat down into the Boston area and return with supplies, and he was met with cheering as well. Another resident of Atusville was named Richard Earl was his name. He was the slave of a white town founder named Jeremiah O'Brien. And Richard Earl, with Jeremiah O'Brien and other white revolutionaries, served in the first naval battle of the American Revolution against the British ship, the Margaretta. So these are just two examples, London Addis and Richard Earl, but the whole community of Atusville arose through, at the end of the American Revolution. So it was they gained their freedom. So they were very much informed. Every resident, not just war heroes, were informed by the rhetoric of the American Revolution, of personal rights and equality and freedom. And the whole larger community that surrounded Atusville of whites were also it was a hotbed of revolutionary activity. So that really impacted and reverberated against the kind of racial elements that were going on in that community. And so I would say from the very start, the American Revolution was just like a tremor or a seismic wave that went through that whole community and definitely involved specific individuals. And some of these individuals are buried in unmarked graves because of their racial status. So they, again, that same conflict, they were war heroes, they were local legends, and yet they also suffered under real obscurity at the same time. We don't even know where their graves are.
Wow, that's really an abstracted idea to think about, and it takes you back to a place very different from today, of course, and a place that is really deeply independent into the how America was created into events like this.
Yeah,
so,
you're absolutely right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just going to tie back to what you just said and the involvement of Atusville to the American Revolution. And at the end of your first chapter, you tie Atusville and you call it a new kind of society that was tied with the rhetoric of American independence. And it's really fascinating to compare the two and see how one was born from the other, or maybe at the same time, and the rhetoric and the ideology of freedom and oppression, it resonates with both.
You're absolutely right, and that's one of the case in point examples of how the Atusville was a small community, but it had this really large impact because it encapsulated these ideals. And that really went throughout its history. So it came into being during the American Revolution and was completely impacted and even defined by the rhetoric of personal rights. And then during the Civil War, it became a microcosm of those same issues, but now inflected through the lens of abolitionism and equality and the fight to actually have possession of your own body. Then during the Reconstruction period, it again became a microcosm of whether different races would be assimilated or separated, and just returned again during the bicentennial as people rediscovered their roots as well. So from the very beginning, its impact and reverberations were much larger than its actual size in terms of population that were living there.
Yeah. And it's so spectacular to learn about that. And as a young historian and an upcoming historian myself, I see things from the larger image all the way down to a small community like Atusville. And in my opinion, that makes so much more sense, and it has so much more meaning to start with those small communities that actually make up the larger ideas of American independence and revolution and freedom. So Very spectacular.
Oh, good point, Evan. And that's going to make you a great historian. Just the recognition of that. Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, I want to move on to um, racial struggle and intermarriage now. In your book, you state that London Atus, he married a white woman. They had as we will call, an intermarriage relationship.
Mhm.
So, when you talk about the racial struggle and the intermarriage, what role does Atusville play in these very crucial issues so early into American history, and especially in a semi-conservative state like Maine at that time?
From the very beginning, Atusville was defined by racial intermarriage and cohabitation, and by acceptance and of different races and ethnicities, but also real striking instances of violence and racism. Even before London Atus married the white daughter of a town founder, Eunice Foss, there were stories that are passed down in the Atus family that London Atus himself could have been the illegitimate son of the Parson Lyons, who was his owner and whom he eventually purchased his own freedom from. We don't really know that, but that is for sure, but that is something that has been passed down on that as well. Certainly the intermarrying took place to such an extent that by the 1870s, after the Civil War, community members were calling the residents of Atusville copper-skinned, and because they were not only mixed with whites, but with Native Americans as well. Mm-hmm. And so in one sense, that intermarrying, which again was something that happened with many of these Black districts and communities throughout Maine, just because demographically there were so many more white people that were surrounding them. But in one sense, it reflects a real model of a more egalitarian society in which people were not just judged and separated by their race and ethnicity, but at the same time, there are some really sobering tales of racial violence that happened. One of these examples of racism involves the very name of Atusville. Atusville was not what the community was known as, and even current living locals from Machias that may have heard about may not always refer to it as Atusville. Its original name was racist, and it reflected, again, a very intolerant idea of other races. So there was an element of real disparagement that was in the very name itself. And then we had other instances that drove that kind of raised their head in Atusville. In 1795, there was a race riot I guess you could call it that, in Atusville. 9 white men terrorized 2 Black women that were living as squatters in the district of Atusville. And their actions of attacking their house at night and terrorizing them and one child that was living in the house, they were all perpetrated by a paternity suit that one of those women had filed in 1795. Her name was Nancy Wilkinson. She was known in the local histories as just Black Nancy, but I was able to uncover what her real name was. She filed a paternity suit in 1795 claiming that her son father was Arthur Gilmore, who was the first school teacher from Machias. As a result of that paternity suit, she and a woman she was living with her child were terrorized. So there we have, in one instance, an example of not intermarriage, because she never married Arthur Gilmore. She just said, he came to my bed while she was working as a slave in the uplands of Machias in the household of a man by the last name of Griffith. So we have intermingling of race. It's not even clear whether this was a consensual relationship, whether it was an example of assault or not. But regardless of what happened, she had this child. She filed a paternity suit for support. She then was terrorized. And so there's a really dark cloud over that community. But then the flip side is it went to court, and there were damages that she did receive, and the men were fined for their actions. So you have in a nutshell there the mingling of different races, the injustice and violence, and but also the flip side, some justice that was given to her. And this continues. There's other examples as well. And I'll just end with one that we can talk about more at length, but the whole formation of having a black school in Atusville, a separate school for just the black children of Machias, which was built in 1853. This came about because of racial violence. Black children were being continuously harassed to the point that they would refuse to go to the white schools.
What strikes me is that the woman actually got justice, though, and you don't really see that, especially at that time. And again, it also strikes how much racial injustice was part of this early community, and just how it was dealt. Very shocking, and because we think today of the North, especially after the Civil War, we tend to see the South as that portraying that image that you just described, but we never tend to see the Northeast with instances like that. At least in the wider image, we tend to see as the liberators of freedom, but there's instances like that makes you wonder about those early communities and what was going on. And the story of Atusville, I think, uncovers some of all of that. Exactly. Yeah, very interesting. I think I need to go do more reading on that specific case that she got justice, because that's such a very important historical piece.
The other thing is it's just remarkable that we even know this woman's name. Like I said, she only came up once in the official histories of Machias. London Addis made his last appearance when being paid $1.50 to bury Black Nancy's child, which was the sad outcome of this whole paternity suit. But then when the Machias historical records of the courthouse were digitalized in a grant project, this name came to light along with some other key documents. So I definitely, again, I owed a lot to local residents, local historians, people like Susan Wright who digitalized these documents. So it was really a community story to bring this to light, because otherwise, who would ever have known this woman's name of Nancy Wilkinson and this whole paternity suit and all her claims and the riot? It was all just kind of like buried. And it really came to light.
Exactly. And it's so important. It kind of feels a little bit of, because history most of the times has the role of justice and remembrance of these events. And projects like this really do the work when it comes to resurrecting in a sense all of this lost knowledge.
Thank you. And resurrection, I think, is a really good word for Atusville.
Most definitely, yes. So let's go back to the school that you mentioned, and then the next topic, I guess, it will be to go more into the fascinating story of the Underground Railroad. So the school you mentioned was it was an idea of the creation of the school because of racial differences.
In 1853, the town of Machias earmarked money and built a small one-room schoolhouse in the community of Atusville, specifically for Black children. They hired a white school teacher. Her name was Eliza Crocker. And the school was built because the Black children had actually taken on a kind of political role. They actually refused to go to the white schools anymore. They were being so harassed to such an extent. at those schools by the other white school children. And while the teachers and administrators undoubtedly tried to prevent this, they were unsuccessful in doing it. And there were other like racist inflected pastimes in Machias that happened at fairgrounds as well. And like I said, there was this racist name of the community that was not originally called Atusville. So all these factors together created this really kind of potent, unfortunate mix in which a segment of the Machias population who were Black and were young were being harassed and assaulted, and then collectively or individually, they just ended up refusing to go to school anymore. And that's when they commissioned the schoolhouse. And then the interesting thing about the schoolhouse, besides its formation, was that the town built it in the middle of the Black cemetery. So that not only violated the deed of the actual burial ground, but must have made a really striking image for these Black children who are going to school in this little schoolhouse right off Court Street in the middle of a burial ground filled with unmarked graves and burial mounds from the residents of Atusville. So
Wow.
again, it was just highlights the kind of unique characteristics of the community of Atusville.
That's very unique and striking. I won't lie. Yes. Wow.
Yes.
Very interesting. Very eye-opening to be able to recognize and see those early Black communities trying to how they dealt with things and how what was the rest of the community's response. And as you mentioned, yes, they try to make a school for them, and that's, I guess, one of the good acts of it. But then making the school in that specific place doesn't really resonate with the previous action as to its, why it happened the way it did. So, have you found the specific place where the school was built?
I have actually, because the burial ground in Atusville is still officially a cemetery, and so that land has not been developed. So it's grown over now. You would never know it's cemetery. It looks like a forest right now or a woodlot, but the cellar hole of the schoolhouse is still there off of Court Street. It's all grown over, but it's still there. And again, it's just remarkable that these remains are still there to be found as well. And so, yeah, in one sense, it was great that the community provided a separate school that was safe for the Black children. But then again, it is unfortunate that it had to come about in that way through assault, and also revealed another way of kind of separation of a kind of like a separate community, a separate burial ground, and now a separate school for Black children. So it also dealt with a really highlighted safety as well as segregation. And so where do you really weigh it over? I'm not quite sure, but it was some of both.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a tough topic to unravel and trying to find the mindset of the people from that era.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, great. So there are a few years that go by, and on your next chapter of the book, and we're going into more of the heydays, as you mentioned, of Atusville, you talk about certain narratives that Atusville played a role in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War and after. And there is even the assumption, and that's where I am extremely interested, and the belief that there is an actual underground tunnel at the area that was used for this purpose. Please give us a little more insight to that, because that sounds so interesting.
Oh, I would love to give more information about the narratives of the Underground Railroad, and then the legends and actual supporting evidence for an actual tunnel underneath the town of Machias. In terms of the support for Atusville, being involved in its residents being involved in the Underground Railroad, part of it is just common sense that Atusville is located not that far from the Canadian border. The height of the community was in the years before the American Revolution. There were a number of members of the Underground Railroad who worked as mariners and then would use their roles on ships to stow aboard their black brethren and brothers and sisters who are trying to escape from slavery. And so some of these, there were definitely a number of residents of Atusville that I researched who worked as mariners. Others had come from places like Virginia. Others had settled there underneath the radar of the official census takers. So all this created a kind of circumstantial, albeit, but definitely pointed toward the community being involved in the Underground Railroad. That assumption also gained weight or has lived on through local legends and oral history of residents living in the area, that Atusville was connected to and part of the Underground Railroad, and some of its residents came there and settled from the Underground Railroad as well. So we have all that. There was definitely a station in Bangor. There's a home in Washington County that is rumored or confirmed to be part of the Underground Railroad. So there's this whole constellation of circumstantial evidence, demographic evidence, geographical circumstances that pointed to this connection. But one of the most intriguing rumors was that it wasn't just a figurative Underground Railroad of people escaping, helping slaves escape into freedom, but there was actually a literal underground tunnel, not a railroad, but an underground tunnel. And when I first came to the Machias area, I heard these legends, and it was connected to Atusville. Some of the legends linked it directly to this tunnel, directly to the Underground Railroad, that the tunnel was used to either hide or smuggle slaves running to escape slavery. But some of the legends linked the tunnel to smuggling, and Atusville had a long reputation of smuggling. Maine had a very long prohibition that had lasted from the 1850s up to the until national prohibition ended. And Atusville was definitely connected to like the other side of the tracks and a place where you could buy contraband liquor. So it's always unclear to me whether the tunnel survived in oral history as one of two things, either a vehicle for smuggling or a vehicle for escaped slaves. But I dismissed the stories of an underground tunnel at first because this is there's very little soil here. You just dig right down. It's like a lot of granite bedrock. And I was like, how could these people eking out a living have actually created a huge tunnel in Machias? But then it was a whole process of discovery to realize that there really was something to this tunnel, and it's not just a legend.
Yeah, and I think in your book you mentioned that there was an instance where the road fell at some aspect, and that's where they think that the tunnel is located in. Please correct me for those details.
No, so like I said, when I first was researching the underground tunnel, I dismissed it as just hearsay and a legend. But then when I was doing the research for the book Lost Atusville, I ended up interviewing a very reliable person who had actually gone through part of the tunnel in the 1950s with three other people. And she confirmed exactly what the legends were, that the entrance to the tunnel was in the cellar of an old Victorian house on the corner of Court and Broadway Street in the center of downtown Machias, and that the tunnel exited somewhere on the Machias River. And the legends had it that it exited out near Atusville, about 3 or 4 miles outside of the center of Machias, somewhere near what used to be the old fairgrounds across from the hospital. So when I heard, she never went through the entire tunnel because they were worried about it caving in. So they entered through this door in the cellar on the corner of Court and Broadway Street. They traveled, I don't know how far into the tunnel. And when I started to look carefully at her reports and description of it, this is my theory, was that the tunnel was carved out entrance, just maybe a system of caves, because she said when she went in, the tunnel had big, great blocks of stone, but the further she went in, the rougher it got. So no one has ever discovered the exit to the tunnel on the Machias River, but we know that the tunnel exists. Then in 2002, on the ground, on the corner of Court and Broadway Street, the Victorian house that hosted this entrance was long since demolished, but the AT&T building, or the Verizon building, was right there on the corner of Court and Broadway Street. The ground opened up one summer day. They thought it was just an old well, and they filled it in, but it was undoubtedly part of the old tunnel coming to light. But then, Evan, this is the amazing thing about it. So I'm doing this research, and I found out, okay, there really was a tunnel. And then I heard all this oral history that it was connected to Atusville and smuggling of either slaves or contraband items. But I wanted to find a stronger connection than just hearsay. And I remembered when I was doing the research and the histories, that London Addis had done road work for the county. So I went back through the old records, and it was really remarkable when I found the record that London Addis in May of 1789 worked for the county building roads, and his district started at the corner of Court and Broadway Street and went all the way to the Middle River. And I was like, when I heard that, it was like a clap of thunder right over me, or a light bulb going on. I'm like, first, I didn't even think they had the names of the streets in 1789, and then that they would list him connected to the exact entrance to the tunnel. I was like, well, that's as close to a smoking gun as I'm going to get.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's a find, as we say. Wow. Based on your research, the founder of Atusville actually helped in digging the tunnel, from what we know, and that's like such an amazing addition to the story.
It was. I really think it is. And I was like, how can that even be still recoverable? I mean, come on, Machias itself is a very obscure little community even today. And then this little settlement of freed slaves living on the outskirts of it. And then to be able to put together that piece of the story, never mind the larger narrative, was just a godsend.
Yeah, it sounds surreal if you just hear the story, but then the more you get into the details, the more it becomes fascinating. And I think that's what I liked about this, and how the more you dive in the story, the more fascinating it gets. And that's the important part about Atusville.
Exactly. Exactly.
The only thing I wanted to add was that there is this misconception, usually in the history of the Underground Railroad, that it's not underground. But then when you get to this point that there was actually an underground part of it, I think that's where it gets, everybody on the same page and everybody interested in hearing more of this side of the story.
Yeah, you couldn't put it better than that, Evan. Absolutely. The existence of an actual tunnel that was linked to a community of freed slaves on the outskirts of Machias really substantiates the most fanciful and, in many cases, unsupported oral history of the Underground Railroad. But in this case, there really was a tunnel. But whether it was used to smuggle slaves or alcohol during Maine's long prohibition, we really don't know. But again, it's slumbering right underneath the modern streets of Machias. And if somebody were to dig around, perhaps the answer would still be lying there.
Yeah, that's I can imagine your feeling as a researcher, going through your research and then this piece of history coming right up, and how you will feel about it, and all of that. It's just fantastic to hear the story coming together.
The lesson that came out of this whole process of researching such an obscure but significant community was that two things was that the past doesn't really go away, in the sense that if you really keep digging, you can uncover so much more. To me, it was an impossible story to even write an article about, never mind a whole book to begin with. They were so marginalized, under the radar, not written about, separated. But again, all of the clues were there in the ruins, reading between the lines, the census reports, the characteristics of the tunnel, of the burial ground, the school. All these things told stories. And it was like learning to read the land, as well as reading census reports, as well as reading anecdotes and oral histories as well. So that was the first lesson, was that the past doesn't go away if you really learn to read in more than one way. And I think the other thing was just kind of like the law of attraction, that if you really want something, you kind of draw it to you, by just your own interest and desire to uncover it. So the more I dug into these stories, and I'm sure many of your listeners out there will experience this too, the more you dig into something, the more it seems to come. And that definitely was a factor in this story.
Yeah, it really captivated me while I was reading it, and very interesting, very important part of Maine history, to the extent that I think in the future, I hope when those, I don't know who writes the Maine history books, but I hope that in the future they definitely include this part of southeastern Maine history into the textbooks, as it just teaches you so much. I can even see just this story being a teaching lesson for either high school or middle school or any kind of grade level and any kind of situation, to be able to learn all of these things just with one example of the small town of Atusville.
Well, thank you very much. I do agree that sometimes the micro reveals the macro, and in this case, it was a real case in point, and you can learn a lot about huge national issues and even international issues through a really small lens in some cases. And this would be one of them. I'm sure there's many other examples too.
Most definitely. They're just waiting to be discovered. Well, great. And I think we did a fantastic job just covering in a little bit of time a lot of the chunk of the story. Yeah. And so give us a little bit of an overview of how was this community abandoned, in a sense, or disappeared, or people left the town, or how did the whole thing work out? Around the 20th century, I think, is when we stopped seeing a lot of action in the town of Atusville.
Atusville reached its heyday in the 1850s, around the time that the schoolhouse was built for Black children. But then it just right after the Civil War, it just experienced a slow, steady decline of the population. And it was actually not just a decline. Some moved away and found other places to live, but others, like we had mentioned earlier, were so intermixed into the larger population that they were just so integrated that they could just pass as white and then just moved off, so that they were no longer just segregated in that one area anymore. So even by the 1870s, residents were remarking that Atusville was kind of like almost like becoming something of the past. The last resident of Atusville His name was Harley Henry. He was a direct descendant of London Addis. He lived right at the railroad crossing in Atusville. His mother was white. His father was black. I did find out that his mother, was the last resident buried in the Atusville burial ground as well. So when he died in 1965, that's kind of like the official end of the community. But again, the ruins were still there. Many of the residents that hadn't moved away were still living in other areas, even if they could pass as white. But then the community still lived on as its own legacy.
Mm-hmm. It became a legend in a sense, right?
Absolutely. Even before it declined, Atusville was always had a legendary quality of like encapsulating the issues of abolitionism and the Civil War, of the Underground Railroad, of the Reconstruction period, of whether we segregate or assimilate different races. And then during bicentennial, digging up our roots, it became, Atusville always was, for such a small size, always had that legendary ability. And that's how it's lived on in many ways as being a representative of something much larger than itself.
Yeah, that's really emotional to see the whole progression of that small town. What will someone, for example, one of our listeners is getting interested in this in this story and goes to that specific place? What will somebody see today where Atusville was? How is the whole landscape of Atusville today?
Someone interested in walking the quote unquote streets of Atusville would need to first know where to look, because you could easily just drive right past it and be right in the center of what was Atusville and not realize it. So your first marker or place of location would be you're heading down Court Street in Machias toward Whitneyville. You will pass the Down East Community Hospital on your right, and about a mile past that, heading toward Whitneyville, on your left, you'll see a wooded, hilly area that's partially cleared that has a granite marker commemorating Atusville. When you stop there, you're in the burial ground. There is, you won't see any gravestones. These were all earthen grave mounds, with the exception of one grave that, here's another tantalizing story, that was dug up at some point in the last century. And that's ironically the only grave you can see is a grave that was actually exhumed. So that's where you'll be. That'll be your easiest marker. Then if you keep traveling, you come back out of that burial ground, you keep heading down Court Street, you're in what would be Atusville. It's wooded, there's a couple homes around there. And then when you get to what used to be the railroad crossing, which is now the Sunrise Trail, that gave Atusville its original racist name of a community at the crossing. That's where Harley Henry lived. That was like the real cluster of the community. And there's also a great hiking trail around that area, and that hiking trail goes down to the Machias River and travels along the banks. And you'll be traveling in all this area in Atusville. What you'll see, if you're not looking really carefully, would just be woods, sparsely populated houses. But if you look carefully, you'll see the signs. You could even find the old schoolhouse, the ruins of it. You'll notice that some of the houses look like they might have been older, like little small houses that could have been there from before the Civil War. And if you begin to like read what you're seeing, you'll see that you're in Atusville.
And I put a question in because I know I'm one of those people that will definitely sometime in the summer probably trying to make a field trip and see this in person. And I encourage any listener that is listening to this to do the same. And because it's different to just listen to the story and it's different to know about the story and visit the place. So Yes, please, if anybody's interested, just explore and do your own research on Maysville, apart from this podcast as well.
Really good point. Absolutely. Yeah, just be sensitive to your perceptions, the things that you see, people that go there, pick up on things, find things, and perceive things as well. So, yeah, it's definitely worth seeing, even if it's subtle, because as I pointed out, the past is still there and it's one way. It still lives on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for all of this. And the final question, it's a personal question. So why do you think, or do you want people to know about Atusville's past?
I want people to learn from Atusville that there's much more to Maine's history, that there's a whole buried diversity and set of stories that are out there that reveal so much more than the common conception of what is the official storyline of this area, but also to commemorate and honor the residents of Atusville who struggled and survived and persisted against such odds, and who also encapsulated so many of the ideals that we hold most dear to us.
Well, Dr. LiBrizzi, it's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate you joining me for this episode. I think I learned a lot about Atusville. I think our listeners probably hear this for the first time, and I hope to learn something about this community. And as an upcoming scholar myself, and as just a citizen, I thank you for your research into uncovering this very important and unknown story from both our states and our nation's history.
Thank you so much, Evan, and thank you so much for hosting me on the History Hour. It was my pleasure to be here today talking about this remarkable community. And you're a great host. I'm sure you're going to be a great historian and scholar. Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to connect with you.
Well, that's all for today's episode of the History Hour. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're interested in learning more about the amazing story of Atusville, the link to Dr. LiBrizzi's book, Lost Atusville, will be posted in the video's description. I wanted to remind all of our listeners that you can find our podcast page on Facebook and on YouTube by simply searching the History Hour podcast. Thank you, and till next time.